Thank you. Looks like a lot of you can hear me, so let's take care of a couple housekeeping pieces of information before we dig into the substance of this webinar. If you have any comments, questions, or concerns about technical or other issues during the presentation, please go ahead and enter them in the chat box you just used in the sound check. If you have questions for the presenters about their presentation, there's a Q&A box. Please enter those questions in the Q&A box. On my screen, the Q&A box is along the bottom, but it's one of the more, I guess it's second from the left on the middle of the screen there. And it has a Q on a box. And then the chat is that little speech bubble with the dots. And then here are some answers to commonly asked questions. Yes, we are recording this webinar, and the recording will be available on the CADCA website following the webinar. Yes, I will be sending out a copy of the slides following the webinar. And yes, CADCA will provide letters of participation to attendees who request one, and I will provide more information about how to request one at the end of the webinar. So welcome everyone to the latest installment of CADCA's Research into Action webinar series. I'm Carolina Duth, and I'm a member of CADCA's Evaluation and Research team. If you haven't previously participated in one of our webinars, the purpose of this webinar series is to introduce coalition members and substance misuse preventionists to current and relevant research being conducted in the substance use and community coalition fields. CADCA, along with its Geographic Health Equity Alliance, are excited to offer this special edition in the webinar series on public health communications. I'm joined for this installment by Anne Cristiano and Dr. Annie Niemand of the Center for Public Interest Communications at the University of Florida. They will present on the topic, The Science of What Makes Us Care, and will teach us how to improve our public health communications. And now I'd like to introduce our presenters, Dr. Annie Niemand and Anne Cristiano. Dr. Niemand is the Director of Research for the Center for Public Interest Communications, housed in the University of Florida College of Journalism and Communications. As the Director of Research, she works with organizations to apply behavioral, cognitive, and social science to their work. Center partnerships include the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees Innovation Service, the United States Department of State, and public interest communications agencies in the United States. Ms. Cristiano is the Frank Carroll Chair in Public Interest Communications and Director of the Center for Public Interest Communications. As Carroll Chair, she is developing a first-ever curriculum in public interest communications, connecting practitioners and scholars who are already working in the field and nurturing and sharing research that can advance this newly emerging academic discipline. Public interest communications uses science-driven strategic communication and storytelling to advance positive social change. Now I'll turn it over to Dr. Niemand and Ms. Cristiano to discuss their work.
Thank you so much, and hello everybody. Thank you so much for joining us. We're very excited to be hearing all of this with you today. In the Center for Public Interest Communications, we are obsessed with finding published academic research that we can share with you to help you do more effective work. And so one of the things that we think a lot about is how do we get people to move beyond raising awareness to driving behavior change. And if you're like us, you wake up in the morning with lots of enthusiasm for the issue that you care about and making a difference. And it can be really frustrating sometimes to feel like people just don't care that much about the message. Why aren't people acting to end some of the issues that we face and worry about every day, whether it's racism or unequal access to treatment, or the other issues that consume us? Or why don't people support critical policies like clean indoor air laws and other policies that can help people be safer and healthier? So a lot of times we think people are failing to act because they lack information. And so we can have this idea that as activists or advocates, our job is simply to share information with those who can most benefit from it, with the idea that they will learn new insights and change their behavior accordingly. And we call that the information deficit model. Here's a definition of that. However, the definition basically says that people are skeptical to science or research because they just don't understand it. And that if we could do a better job of communicating it, then people would care more about it. We have a better way to remember the information deficit model, which is, it is a magnificent unicorn. It would be fantastic if people could simply get new information and change their perspective or their behavior, but that's not how it works. In fact, research suggests that it happens the opposite way, that we look for information that supports our current choices or behaviors. And so the information deficit model is mythological, was never real, just like unicorns. People don't act because they don't care or they don't know how. And so that's what our challenge is. How do we actually get people to care and show them what to do about it? So that means that we have to stop raising awareness. When we talk about raising awareness of issues, one of our friends and colleagues, Kristen Grimm, likes to say raising awareness is half a sentence. Raising awareness is harmful in three ways. The first is that we may reach the wrong audience. We may reach a group of people who are already believing this information and looking for ways to supplement an existing perspective or support an existing perspective. The second is that it could backfire and cause people to act to do exactly the opposite of what you hoped that they will. And the third is that it could actually cause harm. So if you want people to act, you have to make them care and you have to show them what to do. We take a perspective on this that is rooted in public interest communications. And we define public interest communications as a science-driven approach to strategic communications that results in lasting change on an issue that transcends the interest of any single person or organization and advances our greater good. So a couple of things that are important about this. Every recommendation that you'll hear us make today as part of this conversation is rooted in published academic research. We're also really interested in how we might drive lasting change and working beyond the interest of any single organization or advocacy group and focusing on the issue and the greater good. Public interest communications requires us to move beyond communicating about our organization to focusing on the issue. It requires us to focus on what needs to be different to be able to drive lasting change. So it requires us to have an understanding of the systems in which we're working and where we might be driving systems change. And it uses behavioral, social, and cognitive science to connect the issues to what makes people care and how they can form their beliefs and behaviors. So that brings us to a set of principles that we see across research that helps us, that offers insight to what actually makes people care about an issue.
So the first imperative to helping people care about your issue is to bring value to your community by entering their world. If you think about what it's like when you go to a party, you probably don't walk into the room and say, "What up, party? I'm here and I'm really interesting. Who wants to talk to me?" Because that's weird and that's not how people communicate with others, right? Instead, what you do, you walk into the party, you see who's there, you listen to the different conversations that are happening. And when you find something interesting, you find an interesting conversation where you can add value, you provide value by chiming in. And we want you to think about strategic communications as the same thing. Think about strategic communications as finding different communities who are having conversations and listening to those conversations and figuring out how you provide value to them. How does your information help them be a better version of themselves? How does it help them solve a problem? How is your information entertaining and compelling? By doing that, people are much more likely to engage with you and in your information because you're talking about your work in a way that matters to them, rather than simply just putting a megaphone to your message. So no longer should you think about strategic communications as simply amplifying your message. Instead, strategic communications is about finding where your values intersect. So what do we mean by values? Research suggests that people have different values, worldviews, and identities that shape what they engage with, how they see themselves, and how they form decisions. If you think about worldviews, researchers have found that worldviews fall on a continuum. On one end, we have people who are more individualistic and they believe what's good for me is good for everyone else. And on the other hand, you have people who are more egalitarian and believe what's good for everyone else is good for me. And we all fall somewhere on this continuum, and where we fall on the continuum can change based off of the issue at hand. Second, research says that we have different moral values that shape our judgment and our decision making. People who are more conservative tend to value respect for authority, preserving the sacred, and protection of the in-group. People who are more liberal tend to value fairness, justice, and care. And research tells us that when we communicate, we tend to lead with our own values, what resonates with us. But that actually will backfire for you if you're trying to communicate with someone who sees the world differently than you or has a different set of moral values. So it's important that we map out what those are for the communities we're trying to engage so we can craft messages that will resonate. And research tells us when we do that, we're likely to be much more effective in building support from the people we're communicating with, even if they were prior skeptical or deniers of your information. And of course, all of us have different social identities. These are groups that we belong to based off of our interests. And these social identities really guide what we engage with. If you think about what you follow, it probably has a lot to do with how you define yourself, what you care about, what you think about. If you're an academic, you probably follow a lot of academic circles. If you're a fitness enthusiast, I'm sure your Facebook feed or your Instagram feed looks like that. And so we have to know who people are, how they see the world, and what they value in order to figure out how to talk about our message in a way that brings them value. So we want to give you an example of a campaign that did this very well. So this is a campaign that comes from Brazil, and the goal was to increase organ donations. So let's take a look at this, and then we'll talk about what they did right.
Prometo que os seus olhos vão continuar assistindo o esporte.
Que os seus pulmões continuarão respirando pelo esporte.
Prometo que o seu coração sempre baterá pelo esporte.
Hoje a maior dificuldade que existe no processo de doação é o sim da família.
Eu sou rubro-negra até depois de morrer, irmão. Minha alma é rubro-negra.
Ainda mais que quando eu doar meus órgãos, meu pulmão for pro cara do Náutico, torcedor do Náutico, ele vai respirar o esporte.
A campanha atingiu números impressionantes. 51 mil torcedores se declararam doadores, uma quantidade superior à capacidade da Ilha do Retiro.
A campanha do esporte, eu não tenho dúvida alguma que serviu para que, aumentando a oferta de doadores, a gente conseguisse zerar essa lista, conseguisse realizar o transplante que todos estávamos precisando.
Uma campanha de doação de órgãos lançada pelo esporte, está de transformar a vida de muitos torcedores.
No último vídeo, tem passado 2 anos de diabetes e 5 anos de diabetes. E a visão também, a minha visão está voltando de pouco. Eu renasci.
E também a senhora já tem provado a coração da sua mãe. Você pode trazer ela, se você quiser. Daí diante, você tem que aprender a
We love this campaign as an example of providing value to your community. So a few things that really stand out to us is how narrow they draw the circle around a target community. They could have tried to reach everyone in Brazil because everyone in Brazil has organs. But instead, they decided to focus very narrowly on a group of people who had a very strong passion and a very strong identity as soccer fans. And by connecting organ donation to that identity, they were able to motivate them to engage in this action. Now, that might feel like a sacrifice because we tend to want to reach everybody, but you're going to be much more effective if you can connect to people based off of how their identities and what they care about. We also loved that this campaign didn't lead with data. You didn't see a lot of fact sheets and figures out about the needs of organ donations, the challenges. Instead, the audience only saw what they needed in order to be motivated. And they were told, you could be an Immortal fan if you get this card. And so they didn't have to give them all of the data. They didn't have to tell them everything they knew about organ donations. They simply had to tell them enough to make them care. And lastly, the thing that we really like is that in Brazil, there was a taboo against donating your organs because it's connected to their religious identity, and they believed you should only give your organs to family members. So in order to overcome that cultural taboo, they had to activate another identity that was even stronger than their religious identity. And as we saw, what is more important than God to these fans? Soccer. And so they activated the soccer fan identity in order to motivate them to take action. So as you think about your communications, ask yourself, are you connecting with what your target community cares about most?
Thanks, Annie. So the next thing we want to talk about is the importance of using visual language in your messaging. And we're not just talking about great Instagram posts or using actual photographs. We're talking about how you create pictures with your words. Steven Pinker, who's a cognitive psychologist, cognitive scientist, says we are primates with a third of our brains dedicated to vision. And he goes on to say many experiments have shown that readers understand a material far better when it is expressed in concrete language that allows them to form visual images. And so what he's saying here is it's not just about using images in our work, it's about holding ourselves accountable to create pictures in each of our sentences. If you think about people who do this really well, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr.'s speech on the National Mall, the I Have a Dream speech, stands out as an incredible example of this. And I want to play just a few seconds of this speech because you can hear that he creates a visual image with his words in every sentence.
I have a dream that one day on the red hills of Georgia, the sons of former slaves and the sons of former slave owners will be able to sit down together at the table of brotherhood. I have a dream that one day, even the state of Mississippi, a state sweltering with the heat of injustice, sweltering with the heat of oppression, will be transformed into an oasis of freedom and justice. I have a dream that my poor little children will one day live in a nation where they will not be judged by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character. I have a dream today.
So you hear him using image after image after image in his words. We're even using metaphors like content of our character, the table of brotherhood, oasis. He uses an image in every single sentence, and it's almost as though he's created a slideshow in our minds. Word choice is so important that we see that even individual words that connect with an experience are more memorable than those that don't. In one study, scientists studying the sweet versus kind found that people were far more likely to remember the word sweet than kind. And it was also true when they tested the word pair of bitter and mean. People were more likely to remember the word bitter because it connects to an experience. So any word that we choose, any phrase that we choose needs to connect with something visual or something that we can experience. When I was with the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation, we did a project on the social determinants of health, and we demonstrated different rates of morbidity and mortality based on zip codes against the Washington, D.C. metro map, showing policymakers and other Washington influencers and decision makers these stark differences mapped against something that they were deeply familiar with. And we told stories that invoked this metaphor of journey and struggle to as a physical journey. I'm going to skip that story in the interest of staying within our promised time. But what we want you to think about is using visual language to help people remember your ideas. The next thing that we want you to think about is using emotion with strategy and intention. A lot of times when we talk about making an emotional case or an emotional argument, we think about these kinds of commercials or messages. Now, a lot of you probably hear that and are immediately like, turn it off, make it stop. And when those commercials come on, we typically click past them because we don't like to experience messages that make us feel bad or require us to do something that we don't want to do. And while that campaign was really effective when it launched and raised $30 million, when they continued to show suffering animals, people may have felt as though their donations were no longer making a difference, but they were continuing to feel sad. So sadness makes us want to reach out and alleviate another person's suffering. But if we don't have a way to do that or don't feel like we can do that effectively, we'll just turn away from it. Fear makes us flee, fight, or run away. So if we don't know how to fight, we're likely to freeze or flee. So fear can be an effective tool if we know what we're fighting against. Anger, expressed interpersonally, causes us to lose the ability to take the perspective of the person with whom we're angry. But if we experience anger collectively, as a group of people in a room or as a community, it can galvanize us into action and cause us to work together over time. Awe makes us feel small in a big world. It creates a sense of stopping time. And so therefore, when we experience awe, we become more generous, we're more open to new perspectives, and we're more willing to work with others. I'm going to skip that example, but it comes from the film Human, which is a fantastic example of juxtaposing awe-inspiring imagery with perspectives that may be new or challenging. We also see repeatedly that people are more likely to act out of pride than out of shame. So pride can be an incredibly effective emotion to use to get people to act to do something that they might not otherwise have chosen to engage in. Humor has the power to make things small. So when we use humor, we can point it at something that seems very powerful as a way of diminishing its power. Let's share this quick example from a public service announcement that used humor as an effective way to engage people in a behavior they may have otherwise shied away from.
Just you? I'm here to check your prostate. I am the prostate check. You know the time? Oh, not that time. It's time to check your prostate. Hello? Prostate check. Get your prostate check here.
No, that's okay. I don't want to get it checked.
Hey, you're in the right position, you know?
I know.
You're nicely bent. I mean, I can do it here, but it might be very unpleasant for you, right? You mind if I come in and check your prostate? You're sweating.
I know.
I hope you got a chuckle out of this. And I also hope that one of the things that you took from it is that what this is making smaller is the fear of getting checked. Not cancer itself, because cancer itself is not funny, but the fear of getting the screening to possibly discover it early enough to fight it is can be really effective. So as you think about using emotion as part of your work, think about how you're using it intentionally to get people to connect with your ideas.
So we told you that people fail to act because they don't care or they don't know how to. And we've given you some imperatives that can help you help people care. But in order to help people know exactly what to do, we have to give them actionable calls to action. Often when we work with organizations, we see calls to action like, for more information, click here, sign our petition, follow us on Facebook. And while these calls to action might help you understand how many people are engaging with your organization, those actions often leave people feeling like a drop in the bucket. And when people feel like their actions don't make a difference toward the issue, they're less likely to engage in further actions. Importantly, your goal and your call to action is not the same thing. If we think about the Montgomery bus boycotts, for example, the goal was to end segregation on the bus system. But it would have been not wise to give the community in Montgomery the call to action and segregation, because that's such a big call to action. Where would they even start? How would they even do that? And so instead they gave them the call to action, don't ride the bus. And that simple, actionable call to action helped the organizers achieve their goal. So we've looked at the research and we've identified 3 components that make an effective call to action. First, your call to action needs to be concrete and specific. We have looked across academic studies and we have found that ambiguity or big, hard to do calls to action that feel overwhelming lead people to disengage. Instead, we have to give people something very specific to do. And for those of you who have to evaluate your work, we recommend making sure that they're observable calls to action. If they're not observable, then we won't be able to evaluate whether people are actually engaging in the action. So we love the work of Melanie Rudd, who's at the University of Texas, Houston. And she studied calls to action. And in her study, she had 2 groups of participants who were each given a different call to action. One group were told to go out and make their campus more environmentally friendly. Another group were told to go out and increase recycling of a particular material on campus. And unsurprisingly, the group that had the call to action to increase recycling of a particular material on campus were much more effective. They were also much more likely to report feeling happy with what they did, and they were more likely to volunteer again in the future. And she believes it's because they felt that they were more successful and that they were able to make a difference. Just telling people to go out and make a campus environmentally friendly is too big, and people might not know where to start and may not feel like they are that successful. Second, your calls to action need to be meaningful. People need to see how their actions work to solve the problem. If people feel like the thing that they're doing isn't actually going to make a difference toward the issue, they're not likely to engage in that action. We love the work of decision scientist Paul Slovic. He's at the University of Oregon, and he studies why people fail to act in the face of genocide. And in his work, he often cites Mother Teresa, and she says, "If I look at the mass, I will never act. If I look at the one, I will." And what he's found in his research confirms this quote. When we're faced with something really big like mass atrocities, we feel like we can't really make a difference and we can't really comprehend how big of a disaster it is. And so we sort of numb over and we experience what he calls pseudo-inefficacy, where we feel like we can't make a difference toward the issue, so why bother? But instead, when we can talk about our work in a way that makes people feel like they can make a difference toward an individual, then they're more likely to take action. And lastly, your call to action needs to be tailored to your community, meaning they need to know how to do it. We can't give the people we're trying to engage calls to action that are too hard for them, that are outside of their daily habits or routines, because research tells us people avoid information that obligates them to do something they don't want to do. Instead, we have to know the daily lives of the people we're trying to engage and what they're willing to do, and then tailor calls to actions for them that they can easily incorporate into their everyday lives. So we love this campaign that comes from Denver, Colorado, and through a great call to action, they were able to achieve their goal. So prior to 2006, Denver was having a hard time getting residents to conserve water. And they sent out a message for years saying, please don't waste water, to no success. In 2006, they launched a new campaign where they said, go ahead and use water, use only what you need, water 2 minutes less. And after a successful run of that campaign, they were able to reduce water use by residents in Denver to rates as low as they were in the 1970s, despite the fact that the population had increased, just with a better call to action. So let's watch one of the ads from that campaign. Also another example of great use of comedy in communications.
Hey, they're watering again. I love it. Extra water makes me extra awesome. Hey! So that's a little more my way.
Honestly, grass is dumb. Water 2 minutes less. They won't notice.
So that call to action is definitely actionable, and I know how to do that. I can simply set my irrigation system for 2 minutes less. I can water my flowers for 2 minutes less. You're not obligating me to give up something that's important to me, like making sure I have a beautiful garden. Instead, you're telling me to go ahead and do that, but just use what I need. And when we can craft our calls to action in that way, when we're asking people to do something rather than give up something, then they're much more likely to engage. So going back to the Montgomery bus boycotts, we see this campaign as sort of the ideal approach to designing a call to action. It was specific, it was meaningful, and people in Montgomery knew how to do it. So as you think about your work and what you're trying to achieve, are you giving your community something tailored, specific, and meaningful to do?
So our next imperative is to talk in definitions. In anything that we care about, in any field that we care about, there's lots and lots of jargon and specific terms and acronyms that we use. And a lot of times that language is meaningless to people who we might be trying to engage in our work. So we do what's natural. When we're having a conversation with somebody and we use a term that may be new to them, we define it for them. But then we continue to use the acronym or the jargony term. And so Annie and I were noticing that on the show Science Friday and NPR, they do an incredibly good job of helping people understand abstract ideas and helping scientists communicate about those abstract ideas in a way that is specific and understandable. So we called them and asked them how they do that. And one of the things they told us, the producers of the show told us that they do, is that they coach the scientists to talk in definitions. So if they use a term that's specific to their field, they define the term, and then instead of using that specific scientific term, they go on to continue using the definition. Because the reality is that we're most curious about the things that we know most about, which is sort of counterintuitive. So if we want people to be curious about our work, we have to help them understand it in a way that's meaningful to them. That means we need to create a scaffold. And creating a scaffold means that we connect to what they already know about the topic. So if I were to, if we were talking about pomelo, if you've never seen a pomelo, I might describe it to you as a large, green, juicy, and slightly bitter fruit. And you might have a general idea of what that might be like, but if I told you it was an oversized grapefruit, you'd know exactly what I was talking about. So once we do that, instead of saying pomelo, we would continue to describe it as these oversized grapefruit. So once we define the term, we need to continue using the definition, not the term itself. We loved this example that came from Science Friday. This is a geologist talking about different kinds of lava. And he compared it to something that was really familiar to us. He compared different kinds of lava to honey and peanut butter and used that as a way to help us understand it. Now, it is unlikely, I hope, that any of us will ever experience these different forms of lava directly or see them in real life. But because he's connected them to honey and peanut butter, which are very familiar to us, we feel like we understand them much better. So Where are you using abstract terms that you could replace with definitions? So our last imperative is to tell stories. And we work in a college of journalism and communications, and we live and breathe stories all day long. Andy Goodman says stories are the fundamental unit of human communication. So if we're not telling stories, we are not communicating. And Debbie Sensiper, who's a Pulitzer Prize-winning author, said every social movement starts with a story. Charles Fernyhue, who is a neuroscientist and novelist, has said that memory is attached to stories. So if you're trying to get somebody to remember something, you should share that knowledge within the context of a story. And stories also create lasting changes in our brains, according to research by Gregory Burns at Emory University. A lot of times we hear a message strategy and we're like, stories are messages, but stories are not messages. And stories are not vignettes. To actually achieve the cognitive benefits of telling a story, you have to use the narrative arc. And with hope, this is familiar to all of you from your high school days. So as you think about the stories that you're telling as a way of helping people understand your work, think about whether they are actually stories and whether the stories that you tell about your work follow the narrative arc, that have a beginning and middle and end, and include that part of the story where we're concerned that the protagonist, the hero of the story, is not going to make it out. So just to recap, you want to bring value to your audience or community by entering their world. You want to talk in pictures, invoke emotion with strategy and intention, make your calls to action actionable, build curiosity by talking in definitions, and tell stories. So we're happy to answer some questions at this point.
So first, CADCO will ask Ms. Cristiano and Dr. Niemann several questions, and then we're going to turn it over to participants to ask their own questions. So if you have a question for the presenters about their presentation, please go ahead and type it in the Q&A box there at the bottom if you haven't already. I don't see any questions in there, so I'm waiting for all of you to start thinking up something and typing it in there. And I'm going to go ahead and ask some questions while you do that. So this first question stems from the current media climate, but it also harkens back to an issue that we discussed in our June Research in Action webinar. And that issue is that there is quite a bit of inaccurate information about medical marijuana online, and even claims about medical marijuana that cite academic articles can be suspect. So do you think the proliferation of misinformation and propaganda online in recent years has made it more difficult to get people to care about public interest causes and take action? And if so, how can coalitions make sure their communications aren't being dismissed as fake news?
Well, one of the things that we've seen come from nefarious actors who are sharing misinformation or false information is that they're using these imperatives really well. They're using emotion and story and placing that content in places where people are, and using search terms that connect to people's interests and identities in order to get that information in front of them. So let's say you are working to get more women to vaccinate their children. People who are doing that work tend to work with data from Centers for Disease Control and physicians and sort of formal messengers to get that message out. But people who are not for vaccinations often share that through message boards. You get those messages from other mothers. Who are seen as trusted messengers to some who are looking for information about vaccines. We also see that there might be videos on YouTube, and YouTube is one of the top search engines. And so once you search a video and you find something related to that is anti-vaccination, you're then shown more videos related to that. And often the search uses terms that people naturally use to look for information, not terms that are connected to sort of the professionalization of that work in terms of public health and communications. And so how do we counter propaganda? We use all of the imperatives that we presented here in order to do that. We have to be proactive in fighting false and misinformation. And to do that, we can't just fight with more facts. We have to make sure our facts are compelling and entertaining and where people are looking for information.
Thank you. So the second question is, if a coalition member is listening right now and they want to jump in and change their coalition's communications on substance misuse issues, but they don't have a ton of time or resources, which of the 6 imperatives do you think would be easiest for them to start with? And then which one would be more difficult to implement?
One of the things that was the genesis of the 6 imperatives was an understanding that we are all always communicating. And so, but we don't all always choose to control how we're communicating. So one of the things that we hope you'll find with the 6 imperatives is that as you practice them and work to master them, they don't necessarily require you to do more. They require to do what you're already doing differently. So we would challenge you to maybe begin with really, as you generate, let's say you're working on your newsletter, really thinking about not the information that you want to push out, but thinking about what's going to be valuable to people and how they will use it. As you think about communicating in pictures, the next time you are organizing a meeting or working on a presentation, thinking about how you're going to use visual language in that. In one of the things that we encourage people to do is, in every conversation you have, in every email you send, think about what your call to action is. What is it that you hope is going to come of that meeting? What do you hope is going to come of that conversation? And being very clear about what your ask is or what your next steps are.
Thanks. For the next question, I want to know, I think we all, when we're working with communications, know that we should think carefully about what mode of communication we're using, but does the mode of communication influence whether people will ultimately take action? And then which modes of communication do you think are most compatible with using these 6 imperatives?
I have seen significant, one of the things that I've seen is that it is most effective if you're trying to ask somebody to do something, it is most effective to do that in person, that people have a much harder time saying no to something, to a request that's made face-to-face. So I would say that for mode of communication. But I think it's also really important to invest some thought in thinking about which platforms people are already paying attention to and using those tools rather than trying to get people to use a new tool.
And to do that, you would be really thoughtful about entering the specific world of a community. So you can't reach everyone because everyone is so different and we have different identities and values and interests. And so you really have to think, who do I actually have to reach in order to achieve my goal? And think a bit like an anthropologist and figure out where they're paying attention, where they're frequenting, what they look at. And where you place your communications will be dependent on the community you're trying to engage. So for some, it might be podcasts. For others, it might be an annual conference. It just depends on who you need to reach in order to achieve your goal.
All right, I see there's a couple questions in the Q&A box, so keep them coming, everyone. My final question is, where can interested coalition members find more information about your work, and what other resources can you recommend for coalitions interested in improving their public interest communications?
Yeah, if you go to our website, it's jou.ufl.edu, and then you go to public scholarship. That is everything we've ever written, and what you'll find there are probably 2 or 3 dozen articles where we are writing about these frameworks and applying them to different challenges and sharing the science and case studies. So if you head to our website, you can access the work that we've done. But we're also big fans of some other people. We love the book New Power, which is a fantastic book for thinking about how to organize people today and what communication looks like today in our information and social media environment. We also love the book The Righteous Mind by Jonathan Haidt, which is a accessible book by an academic that talks about moral values, which will help you dive a little bit deeper into some of the ideas we were talking about in terms of entering the world of your community. You might follow Andy Goodman's newsletter, Free Range Thinking, which he is one of the OG guys who has been applying storytelling to nonprofit communications, and every quarter he sends out a newsletter talking about how to do storytelling well. You might also check out futurity.org or The Conversation for really accessible summaries of academic research. We like to share that as a resource just so you can start to incorporate some evidence-based insights from the social sciences into your practice. So those are some of the websites that we follow.
Thank you. That's very helpful. I plan to post or links to all of these things, as many of them as I can, on the website. So everyone who's asking about different websites and links and books, don't worry. I'm going to collect all this after the webinar, and it's going to go on the CADCA website with the recording. All right, so now we're ready to move into questions from the audience. We have a few here, so let me take a look. From Jenna, how do these recommendations potentially change when your audience includes primarily youth or young adults?
I don't think they do. I think when you ask about a particular community, I think it just means you have to spend time in that community thinking about what this would look like for them. So for example, if we think about the Truth Campaign, they had a fantastic ad that was targeted at young people to get them to not start smoking. And rather than using the dangerous to your health message, they used a message that said, you're going to lose all your money, or you're not going to have cash in your pocket if you're spending it on cigarettes. And that was a message that they found in their research was effective for youth, because they don't think necessarily about their health in the future, but they do care a lot about having extra money in their pocket. And so what I would suggest is to invest some research time in discovering what these principles would look like for your identified community. And I would even think about bringing representatives from that community onto your strategy team to make sure you're checking yourself and your assumptions.
So to follow on to that question, I have another question somewhat about that, a similar age group. Erica asked, do you have any examples of targeting 21 to 25-year-olds not to provide alcohol to minors?
We haven't looked at any studies that are specific to that. I guess I wouldn't want to give you some suggestions that are not related to such a specific scenario, because we haven't seen research related to that.
All right. Everyone's free to throw more questions in the box if they like. I'm actually going to answer one of them right now, which is that someone is asking to show the 6 imperatives on the screen. And Paula, we're going to share the slides after this, so you'll be able to take a look at them there. Finally, a question from Michael. If you have limited access to personal stories regarding your subject, can you create hypothetical stories that still have authenticity?
I think hypothetical stories are fundamentally inauthentic. And so if you can't tell stories of the people who have directly benefited from your work, you might shift that narrative to tell the stories that you can tell. You might talk about how your coalition was founded and the people behind that. You might talk about some of your volunteers or some of your staff. You might tell stories about how your community would be different if everybody had access to the treatment that they needed.
Yeah, and to add to that, you might look for bright spots or great examples from other organizations and tell those stories. We believe every story should be true, but that doesn't mean that they have to just be your stories. They could be stories from the sector that are compelling and follow the narrative arc and are persuasive, and you can use those in your repertoire.
All right, I don't see any more questions in here. So I'll give everyone a few more minutes to, if anyone has questions, to please go ahead and put them in the question and answer box. While they do that, I'll just talk about several housekeeping things, particularly the letter of participation for this webinar. So if you need a letter of participation for continuing education or some other purpose, please send me an email at kduth@cadca.org, and I will put that email address in the chat box right now. All right, so if you need a letter of participation, email me, kduth@cadca.org. And as I mentioned earlier, I'm distributing the slides, and I will also post the webinar and the resources that were mentioned earlier on the CADCA website. So we do have one more question. It's from Lindy, and she says, how can they improve communications when the community trust is low?
I think it would be helpful to think more about the specific challenge that you were trying to solve. Whose trust in the community is low, and who do they trust? And think about who you can, how you might be able to think about looking at who they do trust and communicate with in the context of what they already believe and trust.
Thank you. All right, we're going to go ahead and wrap up the webinar, but before we do so, I want to let everyone know about the next webinar in this series. So if you can go ahead and switch to the next slide, please. In the next installment, Dr. Robert DuPont, Dr. Bertha Madras, and Dr. Caroline DuPont will present the findings from their article, Drug Use Among Youth, National Survey Data Support Common Liability of All Drug Use, which discusses how youth use of one substance is associated with use of additional substances. And this webinar will be held on October 23rd at 1 p.m., so mark your calendars. And finally, I would like to thank Ms. Cristiano and Dr. Neiman for the wonderful presentation they just gave on their research, and also for their tireless work providing relevant and current material. And thank you to webinar participants for your comments and questions and insights. And if you need any help with evaluation or research related issues, please send an email to evaluation@cadca.org. And hope to see you all at the next webinar on October 23rd.